What's up, Hearts Over Everything podcast listeners? I'm Dr. Carleigh. I am back again today for another episode of the series that we've been doing all about health. So if you haven't tuned in yet, and this is your first episode, I am a naturopathic doctor located in San Diego. And one of the Hearts Over Everything podcast founders, Eric, and I have actually formed a really close relationship over the last year. And he asked me to come on and talk about some things related to health, related to wellness, that would be empowering for his audience. Because we both realize the importance of having a healthy, productive listener and viewership out there so that you guys are empowered to be able to do the things that you need to do to make this world a better place, right? So today, I'm actually going to talk about a little bit more of a serious topic. In my first podcast, I talked a little bit about the background of a naturopathic doctor. So if you're not familiar with that term, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to that one. And in the second podcast, I talked about some of the different myths surrounding medicine today. So I highly recommend, if you have not listened to either of those, go ahead and listen to them. They really kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today, and then everything else in the rest of this series. But so today we're going to cover a little bit more of a serious topic, and that topic is the advent of chronic disease in America. And I really wanted to make sure we touch on this because honestly, no conversation about health is really complete without addressing the problem at hand, which is this massive amount of chronic disease that's happening in the United States. So with all that being said, why the heck does chronic disease matter to you, right? You probably know someone who's affected by it, whether it be a family member, friend of a friend, or something like that, or you yourself are affected by it. There are some pretty damning stats here about chronic disease. So 6 in 10 Americans have one chronic disease, and 4 in 10 Americans actually have two, which is a big deal. That's a lot of people within the United States. And just some numbers that come from the CDC they're pretty intense. So in terms of chronic disease spending, so healthcare spending that we actually do every single year, we spend $3.5 trillion in healthcare costs, and 90% of that is for chronic diseases. So guys, we are literally spending trillions of dollars on chronic diseases. To put that in perspective a little bit, we spend about $694 billion in education and $686 billion on defense. So those two numbers combined don't even equate to the amount that we spend on chronic disease annually. That's a really, really big number. And the reason why I think it's so important to discuss the economic and fiscal impact that this has is because most of these chronic diseases are completely preventable. And guys, I want to harp on that for a second, is that the choices that you all make now, today, tomorrow, they have a huge impact not only on your life and your quality of your life, but then also on what you end up having to pay across your life in terms of healthcare spending. So simply by making healthier choices now, today, you can save yourself and your family a lot of money in the long run. So, as a naturopathic doctor, holistic doctor, if you will, I look at all different pieces of someone's health and wellness, and your financial health and wellness is also a piece of that too. So just want to make sure we understand we're on the same page. It's not so much, it is that I want to make sure that you understand what chronic disease is and where it comes from, but also I want you to understand that investing in your health early makes a huge impact long term. So let's talk a little bit about the different types of chronic disease, and I'll paint the picture about how impactful those are within the United States. Number one is heart disease and stroke. So that accounts for nearly a third of all the deaths that happen in the United States every single year. It costs us about $199 billion a year and $131 billion in lost productivity, meaning people who are not able to now go to work and do jobs and contribute. Cancer. Each year in the United States, we have more than 1.6 million people being diagnosed with cancer. Almost 600,000 actually die from it, which makes it the second leading cause of death in the US. The cost of cancer care continues to rise and is expected to reach almost $174 billion by 2020. So we'll see at the end of this year what it got up to. Next up, we have diabetes. This is one we're all pretty darn familiar with at this point. So more than 34.2 million Americans have diabetes, and another 88 million adults in the US have a condition called pre-diabetes, which is literally just like it sounds, pre-diabetes, which puts them at risk for type 2 diabetes. It can cause some really serious complications, including heart disease, which we already talked about, kidney failure, blindness, amongst many other things. And in 2017, the total estimated cost of diagnosed diabetes was $327 million. Next up, Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia. It's considered irreversible and progressive, and it affects nearly 5.7 million Americans. It's the sixth leading cause of death among all adults and the fifth leading cause of death for those aged 65 or older. In 2010, the costs of treating Alzheimer's disease were estimated to fall between $159 billion and $215 billion. By 2040, these costs are projected to jump between $379 billion to $500 billion annually. These are huge numbers that we're talking about, guys. And the reason I wanted to put Alzheimer's actually behind diabetes is that there is some research out there now that's surfacing that kind of suggests that Alzheimer's might be what we call type 3 diabetes. It's not written in stone yet, but there is a correlation with Alzheimer's and some of the same disease processes that happen in type 2 diabetes, namely insulin resistance. More about that later. Obesity. Yes, obesity is considered a chronic disease. It affects almost 1 in 5 children. I want to just say that, children. 1 in 5 children are obese, which is a huge number, and 1 in 3 adults, putting people at risk for chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, cancers, and over a quarter of all Americans 17 to 24 years old are too heavy to join the military. Guys, this is a population that should not be too heavy to join the military. Obesity costs the U.S. healthcare system $147 billion a year. This one is particularly important because you may have noticed, as I mentioned, that this one kind of sets the stage for all of these other chronic diseases, right? So obesity, pre-diabetes, heart disease, cancers, they all kind of fall in line after that. Arthritis. Arthritis is something that affects 54.4 million adults in the United States, which is about 1 in 4. That's a lot of people. It's a leading cause of work disability in the U.S., one of the most common chronic conditions, and a common cause of chronic pain. We have a lot of people, and I can say this as a practitioner, we have a lot of people walking around out there in just chronic daily pain every single day looking for solutions. The total cost attributable to arthritis and related conditions was about $304 billion in 2013. Of this amount, nearly $140 billion was for medical costs and $164 billion was for indirect costs associated with lost earnings. Kind of the same principle we were talking about with lost productivity costs, people who literally cannot go to work because they're in too much pain or there's too much stiffness happening. An important note to make about all of these chronic disease, about many of these chronic disease, this is one of the underlying factors with chronic disease, is that they don't come out of nowhere. People don't wake up one morning and all of a sudden they're obese, or all of a sudden they have diabetes, or all of a sudden they have heart disease. These diseases take years to develop. Which again, going back to my earlier point where the choices that you make every single day play such a huge role in your longevity and health over time. And perhaps this is nowhere more true than in the instance of chronic disease, right? So this is something that I want people to start feeling empowered over instead of debilitated over or victimized by. you have a lot of sway in whether or not you will develop chronic disease in life. So this is the importance of, not only making decisions, but also preventing and treating early, right? Because if we get to a point where I'm able to say, meet with a patient and they're doing okay right now, they kind of just feel a little off, maybe a little tired. We run some blood work and we find out that they have something that could, some blood that maybe some high lipids or some inflammation inside of their blood. We can say, hey, you know what? You're not there yet, but you might be in a couple of years. If you do nothing, you might be at the point where you might be pre-diabetic. Or you might be setting yourself up for cardiovascular disease, particularly if that person has members of their family who have been through something like that or been diagnosed with something like that. And based on that, we can prevent them from getting or progressing into a chronic disease state. Versus the other hand of that is when you get someone who comes in and they've already had diabetes for, let's say, 10, 15 or more years. Now we're playing more of a management game, right? We're working on managing symptoms most of the time and making minor changes in terms of whether or not we can regress the disease state. And another thing that I really want to highlight about these conditions that we talked about, particularly heart disease, so cardiovascular diseases, strokes, diabetes, pre-diabetes, obesity, and maybe even Alzheimer's, is that there's one thing that really underlies a lot of these, and it's poor metabolic health. So with that, obviously, we got to talk about what the heck is metabolic health, right? People hear metabolic and they think metabolism, right? So how fast you're able to burn through your food. A lot of people equate it with being thin and skinny and all that type of stuff. And yes, that's a piece of it. But really what metabolism, metabolic health is how well is your body taking the fuel that you give it and utilizing it so that it's not building up and being stored in different areas and fat deposition and things like that. And how sensitive are you to being able to use that fuel as well? So insulin resistance is a term that I think a lot of people have heard. But what insulin resistance really means is you have someone who's really kind of become insensitive to its own hormones and ability to use fuel that is you're giving your body in an effective way. So metabolic syndrome is actually a diagnosis that's becoming a lot more common these days. I actually see it in my office a lot. Metabolic syndrome can also be caused sometimes syndrome X. I don't think people really call it that much anymore. Metabolic syndrome is definitely the more correct terminology. But what it is it's defined as being abdominal obesity, right? So abdominal weight, carrying weight around the abdomen, having insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and high blood lipids, so high cholesterol, high triglycerides, those types of things. So you need to fit at least those characteristics to be able to be diagnosed with metabolic syndrome. And I got to tell you guys, there's a lot of people that I see who meet this criteria. In fact, there was a study done in 2018 that suggested that only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy. And this is when you think about the amount of chronic disease that we have going on out there, it makes sense that that would be the case. And to note, this study didn't just include people that already had diseases or things like that. It included people who were young, people who were old. There was a lot of variety included in this study. And so that also points to another thing that I want to highlight is that just because someone is, let's say, thin, doesn't necessarily mean that they're metabolically healthy, right? There's a lot more that goes into it in terms of health than whether you're just skinny or fat, right? So chronic diseases really come from this state of poor metabolic health. So the following are just some disease states that have been associated with poor metabolic health or metabolic syndrome. Obviously, metabolic syndrome, pre-diabetes as well. Type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and then something that is called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a diagnosis that's on the rise right now. It basically, I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that when people drink alcohol too much, they get fatty liver deposits. So this is why we call it non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, because it is fatty liver disease that's occurring in the absence of alcohol. And really what it comes from is too much basically processed sugar, fructose intake. And that causes the liver to basically have fat deposits around this. And sadly, this is a diagnosis that we're starting to see in children now, not just adults. The risk factors associated with chronic diseases, all right, and metabolic syndrome as well, right? So poor metabolic health. And I want you guys to pay extra close attention because these are all things that you have direct control over. So number one is a sedentary lifestyle, not getting enough physical activity. So it's got huge high health complications and or implications and huge financial costs down the line. Can lead to heart disease, type 2 diabetes, cancers, obesity. In addition, lack of physical activity costs the nation nearly $117 billion annually for related health care. And this is coming directly from the CDC. So it's not just my opinion. The CDC has done studies on this and have calculated that it's costing us $117 billion annually. The Western diet is another thing that's associated as a risk factor of chronic disease. So Western diet, what does that really mean? It means a diet that's based off of processed, packaged, unnatural types of foods, right? So basically the thing that I tell my patients is if it comes in a box or a bag and it's got ingredients on the back of it that aren't something that you would be able to pull out of the ground or get off of an animal, that means you shouldn't probably be eating it. So a really great thing for people to just do is just set up a boundary where you only stop the perimeter of the store. Typically, that's where they keep the whole natural foods. Another one of the risk factors for metabolic syndrome, probably not too surprisingly, is being overweight. Next is smoking. Luckily, cigarette smoking is something that has declined massively in the United States, but still, there are still people who do it. It's the leading cause of preventable death and disease in the U.S. Despite the fact that less and less people are doing it, it is still the leading cause of preventable death. And this is probably important to talk about because of the fact that people are now switching out smoking for vaping. It's not a healthier option. It's definitely not a healthier option. In fact, we don't really know what the long-term health implications of vaping are. What we can say is that there is a lot of different chemicals that are involved inside of that vaping apparatus that could potentially have some pretty rough effects on you long-term. So if you are someone who is participating in that, I just urge you to think again. More than 16 million Americans have at least one disease that is caused by smoking. It amounts to $170 billion in direct medical costs that could be saved every year if we could prevent youth from starting to smoke and help every person who smokes to quit. All right. Another risk factor is alcohol use. So I kind of alluded earlier to the idea of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but people who do participate in using binge drinking or heavy drinking or anything like that, they are also putting themselves at risk for development of one of these chronic diseases, particularly anything that has to do with that abdominal weight gain, because it changes the way that your body actually stores fat. It changes your ability to basically be insulin resistant, all of those types of things. Unfortunately, those with what we call a low socioeconomic status are also at risk for chronic diseases. And this could be for a lot of different reasons. It could be due to lack of education, lack of resources, lack of ability to know what to do should they have those resources. There's a lot of different factors here. Finances, obviously, are a piece of that too. And that's something that as a nation, we need to do a better job of. We also have a genetic risk factor as well. Now, I definitely talked about this in podcast number 2 as one of the myths surrounding medicine, that your genetic predisposition determines your life. And that's not necessarily true. Knowing what we know about epigenetics these days and your ability to have a say in how your genetics are actually put out into the world, right? But you have to make sure that you're doing the right things. And I will tell you that, partaking in any of these other things like sedentary lifestyle, alcohol, smoking, all those types of things, they will alter your genetics in a negative way so that you are more likely to express negative things that have been in your family history, such as, if your family history is really strong for obesity or strokes or something like that. Making these other types of choices will make it more likely that your genetics are expressed in that negative way. Another big thing is stress. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next 2 upcoming podcasts, where we're going to talk about stress, your nervous system, and your hormones and how that all interrelates. But I'll just kind of leave that there for now, that stress is actually something, high levels of stress chronically throughout a lifetime can predispose people to develop chronic diseases. And last but not least, obviously, we've got diet in there. And again, that kind of comes back to the low socioeconomic. It could be whether due to choice, whether due to lack of access or education. There's a lot of different reasons for this, but just know that your dietary choices are very closely correlated with the development of chronic disease. So clearly, after we've looked at all this, it's pretty obvious that something in the way that we as a nation have been addressing health is not working, right? And that it's time for a change. And this is just something that I just want to bring to the forefront, because there are a lot of really amazing practitioners out there, people like myself, and even just consumers who are starting to wake up and realize the enormous situation that we have in our hands right now, but also starting to realize that this is a huge opportunity for us as a nation to come together and to say that we deserve better and we want better for ourselves. So I urge you guys to, if you're someone who maybe comes from a family where there's a lot of chronic disease, or you yourself are maybe looking down that pathway, or even if you don't have any of that in your life at all, maybe you've been the healthiest person ever, but maybe you're thinking that you have something to offer in terms of teaching others. I highly urge you to start thinking of this as something that you can help to address. I know this is part of my life. My life's mission is that I want to help people to prevent ever going down this pathway, because I believe that when you are someone who's just plagued by chronic health issues, it really saps away your ability of being able to actively participate in life in a full way, right? If you're constantly running around to doctor's appointments, spending money on medications, dealing with those side effects and things like that, it's a hard way to go through life. And I want to save people from going down that path and save them from that pain. So this podcast right here, I know it's kind of a bummer and I feel weird leaving it on this note, but I wanted to insert it here because I just want people to have a moment to really reflect and understand the gravity of the situation that we as a nation are being faced by. I also want to give a little bit of a ray of hope, because there are a huge amount of practitioners out there, naturopathic doctors, integrative specialists, holistic doctors, functional medicine doctors even. We all kind of fall under the same category of people who really are seeking to prevent disease and treat at a root cause level so that people don't have to keep playing this game of constantly just managing symptoms and things like that. So with that, I'm going to leave it there. We will get back to more empowering things around this. So in our next episode, I'm going to talk about, like I alluded to, the stress, nerves, your nervous system, and hormones. And we're going to give you some real actionable things that you can do about it. And then in our very last podcast, I'm going to talk all about health without a doctor, right? So we've talked a little bit about chronic disease, but so what are you going to do about it on a daily basis? How are you going to go about living your life? So I encourage you all to keep tuning in. We're going to be dropping a lot of knowledge here. So thank you for listening today, and I will see you on the next one.